House of Representatives, the Democratic leader of the United States House of Representatives, and the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. Please stand for the presentation of the colors and the playing of our national anthem.
So proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and in the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Colors, right shoulder, ho!
Please remain standing for the invocation by the United States Representative from the 5th District of Missouri, the Honorable Emanuel Cleaver.
Let us pray. God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God of justice, peace, and hope, we gather in your presence here to remember the life of a great world citizen, Martin Luther King, Jr. Through his words, wisdom, and work, inspired by you, we've been taught to learn to give our best in human relations. We've learned that we should live with each other as brothers and sisters in this magnificent world in which you have graciously placed us. So, Lord, as we gather here as members of the United States Congress, may we somehow sing, even silently, "Let there be peace on earth," and let this be the moment, and let it begin with us. So as we gather to remember Dr. King and his dream, we pray that we remember that we as the people of this great nation and this great political body, we have quite often failed to hear the heavenly call for peace and justice. But on this day of remembrance, when we think of those who've given their lives not only on battlefields but on balconies, we thank you for them, and we thank you for Dr. King and his ministry. He had a sense of duty and a willingness to risk all for his commitment to peace and justice. And so now, God of peace that passes all understanding, we pray our remembrances and our hopes in the name of the God who is called by different names in different faith traditions. Amen.
Please be seated. The Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, the Honorable Paul Ryan.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Capitol. I want to especially thank our keynote speakers for being here. I want to thank you, Lonnie Bunch, who's done a phenomenal job at the museum. And I want to thank Martin Luther King III and our colleague, our conscience, the great John Lewis. Thank you for being here today. One of my very favorite authors is C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." I like that. By it I see everything else. In our lives, in the very finite time that we have, we strive to bear witness to God's glory. Each of us does this in our own unique individual way. Few witnessed with such urgency and such passion as did Martin Luther King Jr. He made America look up, and just as important, he made America look within. By his works, we saw the great promise of the American idea. We saw all that was possible for all of our children. By his struggles, by his death, we saw the pain lying underneath. We saw the nation's knees buckle. Through him, we saw everything else. We see it still. We see it here today in people from different backgrounds, from different, often very different persuasions, all of whom are coming together to honor Martin Luther King's life and legacy. In recalling bloodshed meant to divide us, we embrace what unites us, what obligates us to each one and another. It is that beautiful vision of America, where the condition of your birth does not determine the outcome of your life. We all have some part to play in this pursuit. Dr. King spoke of this in his last Sunday sermon at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where he served as co-pastor. He talked about harnessing the drum major instinct by reordering our priorities and by being great by serving others. These days, it is really easy to get distracted. It is really easy to let the seemingly urgent crowd out the truly important. But we each owe each other much more than that. So we are gathering here in this people's house to listen and to reflect on a man's legacy and its meaning for all of us. As for that Sunday sermon, it was played at Dr. King's funeral just 2 months later. With thanks to the King Center, we open our ceremony by playing a portion for you now. Again, thank you so much for being here.
We all think about it, and every now and then I think about my own death, and I think about my own funeral, and I don't think of it in a morbid sense. And every now and then I ask myself, what is it that I would want said? And I leave the word to you this morning. If any of you around, when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. And every now and then I wonder what I want them to say. Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That isn't important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the walk question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try tried to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind, but I just want to leave a committed life behind. And that's all I want to say. If I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word song, if I can show somebody he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a Christian, or if I can bring salvation to a world once lost, if I can spread the message as the Master taught, then my living will not be in vain.
The Democratic leader of the United States House of Representatives, the Honorable Nancy Pelosi.
Good afternoon, everyone. I thank the organizers of today for not putting me behind John Lewis. I didn't realize that I would be following the Reverend Martin Luther King with one of the greatest speeches of all time. Thank you, Speaker Ryan, for bringing us together. Thank you, Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, for your beautiful words of inspiration. It's an honor I'm pleased to join the Speaker in welcoming our guest speakers here, Reverend Martin Luther King III. Thank you for sharing your father, your siblings, and your mom sharing your father with our nation, with our country, with our future. It's an honor to be also here with the legendary Lonnie Bunch, the outstanding leader of the extraordinary National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thank you, part of the Smithsonian Institution. We gather here in Statuary Hall beneath Cleo and her clock. Cleo is the muse of history, and men and women in these hallowed halls that are part of history. And Cleo is there to judge that our words and action would face the judgment of history, and that we are part of the long and honorable heritage of our democracy. Dr. King was a singular man, an exemplar of exceptional faith and vision, a clarion voice for thundering moral righteousness. The tragic day in Memphis, the world lost a great light and justice. As we celebrate Dr. King's life, we also honor the workers, men and warriors who marched and fought for justice with him across the nation, including another of our honored guest speakers today, inspiration to the Congress, Congressman John Lewis. We'll be hearing from shortly, whom I did not want to follow, but. In the 1950s, the Kings, Coretta Scott King and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., traveled to India to study Mahatma Gandhi's principles of nonviolence so they could apply them to the civil rights struggle here at home. In Sanskrit, the word for nonviolence, satyagraha, it has two meanings. It means nonviolence, and it means insistence on the truth. Insistence on the truth and nonviolence. Though they knew it would mean sacrifice and struggle for their family and for many others across America, the Kings would insist on the truth at the heart of our nation. That truth, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Dr. King insisted on that truth at lunch counters, marches, and churches. He insisted on that truth of his dream, a dream of equality and opportunity for all, regardless of race, gender, or creed. He insisted on the truth of economic justice when he said, God never intended for one group of people to live in superfluous, inordinate wealth, while others live in abject, deadening poverty. He insisted on the truth of healthcare as a right when he said, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and most inhumane. Our chair of our Congressional Black Caucus, Mr. Cedric Richmond, hears that said over and over again by Mr. Cleaver on the floor of the House. So much more of Dr. King's dream and his truth remain to be achieved. But I have hope because of the young leaders across the nation who are advancing America's journey of progress for all. As Dr. King united a generation that struggled to dismantle discrimination, these courageous young people are blazing a trail toward a more perfect union, our goal. The day before his death, Dr. King proclaimed, "The greatness of America is the right to protest for right." And the eloquent student leader from Parkland in our patriotic young dreamers and the champions of Black Lives Matter and the women who say Me Too, the truth of Dr. King's words ring clearer than ever. On this anniversary, let us stand with these young champions as they demand action and justice in the tradition of Dr. King. And let us honor Dr. King always by standing on the mountaintop, insisting on the truth, and advancing the radiant promise of progress for all. As Dr. King said in his remarks, this cannot be in vain. We all do know that as we pray for God to bless America, God truly blessed America with the leadership, life, and family of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Thank you.
United States Representative from the 2nd District of Louisiana and Chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Honorable Cedric Richmond.
Good evening. Let me start with thanking both the Democratic and Republican leadership, Speaker Ryan, Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and the Whip, Steve Scalise, along with my leader, Leader Pelosi, and our Whip Steny Hoyer and our Assistant Leader, John Clyburn, for putting this on. And to the Congressional Black Caucus, 48 members, representing 78 million Americans around this country, doing it in a king-like spirit, which is why we have earned the reputation as the conscience of the Congress. And to the King family, and Martin, who's here, my Morehouse brother, and Dexter, my other Morehouse brother, and Bernice, my Spelman sister, thank you for your sacrifice and what you all have done to continue to bring the dream to reality. And I want to set the scene. 1946, 5 African Americans were lynched in Georgia. It was a national story. One of the men was a World War II veteran who was simply trying to vote. One of the women was 7 months pregnant. These injustices incensed a 17-year-old student at Morehouse College. The lynchings incensed him so much that at 17 he decided to write a letter to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution to talk about those injustices. Let me just read a portion of what he said. "We want and are entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of every American citizen. The right to earn a living at work for which we are fitted by training and ability. Equal opportunities in education, health, recreation, and similar public services. The right to vote, equality before the law, and some of the same courtesy and good manners that we ourselves bring to all human relations." That was a 17-year-old student named Martin Luther King, Jr. A few years later, at the age of 26, he would go on to lead the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama. Today, he inspires that same courage and conviction from young people who are standing up and speaking out about the basic humanity of black people. These young people call themselves Black Lives Matter. They understand that you can assassinate a leader, but not a dream or an ideal. Interestingly enough, these young people are being surveilled by the same federal government just like Dr. King, something the FBI calls today black identity extremists. But these aren't the only young people who are following in the footsteps of Dr. King. The women who led the Women's March are following in his footsteps. The high school students who led the March for Our Lives are following in his footsteps. And if you truly understand Dr. King and his dream, then you know that he would support all of these movements. He would support them because they're a continuation of his legacy. He would support them because they're changing the world for the better. He would support them because these activists love mercy, are doing justice, and walking humbly with their God. Unfortunately, we adults have left these young people to fight some of the same battles that Dr. King fought and won. Police brutality, voter suppression, and pay inequality. Toward the end of his life, Dr. King launched the Poor People's Campaign, a campaign to eradicate poverty across America, not only in the black communities, but all communities where poverty exists. As part of this campaign, he talked about how class divisions in America contributed to the issue of poverty, and that all work, including the work of sanitation workers, had dignity. In a speech he delivered in Memphis less than a month before he was assassinated, Dr. King spoke to a crowd of poor, working class, and middle class people that had gathered in support of the 1,300 African American sanitation workers who were protesting poor labor conditions. And a portion of what Dr. King said there was, I've always said that if we are to solve the tremendous problems that we face, we're going to have to unite beyond the religious line. But there's another great need, and that is to unite beyond the class lines. You've revealed here that you recognize that no D is as significant as the PhD, and that the man who has been to no house is as significant as the man who has been to Morehouse. And I just want to commend you. And that passage reminds me that even though Dr. King was born into a family that wasn't poor, he dedicated his life to helping the poor. As human beings, we have an obligation to do the same. Some say that poor people need to lift themselves up by their bootstraps. I'll remind you what Dr. King said about that. It's all right to tell a man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps, but it is cruel and just to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps. If we truly want to honor Dr. King's life and legacy, we have to stand up and speak out about all types of injustice. And we also have to help those who are less fortunate than ourselves, those people who don't have any boots. His living was not in vain. Thank you, and God bless you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the United States Army Chorus.
Take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, and I am worn. the storm and through the night. Lead me on through the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, and lead me on. When my way grows drear, precious Lord, I want you to linger near. When my life is almost gone, hear my cry, hear my call, hold my hand, lest I fall. Take my hand, precious Lord, and lead me on. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, and I am worn. But as a river or sand, guide my feet, hold my hand, take my hand, precious Lord, and lead me home.
United States Representative from the 5th District of Georgia, the Honorable John Lewis.
Mr. Speaker, my beloved brothers and sisters, Mr. Speaker, thank you for organizing this tribute to my leader, my inspiration, my friend, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. 50 years ago, I was campaigning with Robert Kennedy in Indianapolis when we heard that Dr. King was assassinated. 50 years later, it is still painful. I do not know what would have happened to me without learning the way of peace, the way of love, learning the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence from Dr. King. I first heard of Dr. King and Rosa Parks when I was a boy growing up in rural Alabama near the little town of Troy. I remember listen with my brothers and sisters to the news of the Montgomery bus boycott on the old radio. Back then, segregation and racial discrimination were the law of the land. People of color in many parts of the Deep South could not register to vote. Some people were asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar. Racial segregation and discrimination were the law of the land in libraries, on buses, and on trains, at lunch counters. You could not escape the stench of fear and hate, especially in the American South. When I would see those signs saying white men, colored men, white women, colored women, I would ask my parents, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents why. And they would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in trouble. For many of us, Dr. King was a breath of fresh air. His strength and his dignity inspired us. His message of peace, his message of love and nonviolence helped us find a way to get in the way. His faith and his teaching moved a generation to act, to get in good trouble, necessary trouble. This one young man, he was so young, he sparked a nonviolent revolution. A revolution of values, a revolution of ideas, a revolution of action, not just in America, but around the world. When Dr. King was assassinated, I felt like something died in each and every one of us. But I remember in that painful moment saying to myself that we still have Bobby. Then a short time later, he was gone. They were our future, and their deaths were the end of our innocence. I believe in my heart of hearts that if they had lived, maybe, just maybe, our country and the world would be much better, so much better. In the past 50 years as a nation and as a people, we have made progress. But all around us, there are new forces trying to turn back the clock and take us to a darker time. If Dr. King was with us today, he will continue to push our country to respect the dignity and the worth of every human being, no matter where they are born, no matter their race, age, religion, or gender. He will ask each and every one of us to dig deep, to have faith, and to press ahead. If Dr. King could speak to us today, I think to the very young, he will say, go ahead. He reminds us that history is never kind to those who stand on the sideline during the moral questions of their time. Dr. King would encourage us to be brave, to be bold, to be courageous, and to stand up, to speak up, and to speak out in the face of injustice. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, founding director of the National Smithsonian of African American History and Culture, Mr. Lonnie G. Bunch III.
I am so honored and so humbled to take part in this ceremony to celebrate and remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose life, whose vision, whose belief in an America that had not yet existed, and whose ultimate sacrifice changed the nation and pointed us towards the possibilities of a more perfect union. How fortunate this country is to have citizens like Dr. King, who did more than remind us of who we are, who did more than identify the challenges we face, but who helped us dream who we could become. Because Dr. King's life was a clarion call for Americans to become involved, for Americans to work to effect change. He taught us that protest in the service of helping a nation fulfill its promise is the highest form of patriotism. When we think of Dr. King, we often remember the soaring oratory that came out of a tradition deep within the African American church. His words inspired us. They defined the racial barriers of America. But yet, more important than anything else, his words gave us hope. But those words, that voice, also challenged the laws of segregation and prodded this nation to illuminate and to confront all the dark corners of oppression and discrimination. We learned from Dr. King that a people inspired by hope can change laws, attitudes, and a nation. So many of the images that we see of the civil rights movement show Dr. King leading marches from Birmingham to Selma to Chicago. Marches that were concrete manifestations of the thousands who believed that time had come for change. Yet, candidly, when we often view the civil rights movement, we view it through rose-colored glasses that allows us to forget just how difficult the struggle for equality was and continues to be. People forget that in 1966, in a Gallup poll, 2/3 of Americans had an unfavorable view of Dr. King. To some, he moved too slow. To others, he pushed too far and too fast. But that is why, candidly, I am more moved by images that reveal a Dr. King who was disappointed, who was weary of the battles, who contemplated a setback, or who was just plain exhausted by the stress of uncertainty. Because no matter the burden, what Dr. King had was a resiliency, a selflessness that allowed him to continue the struggle, that allowed him to fight the good fight, regardless of the burden. It seems to me that one of the great things Martin Luther King has left us is that he knew how important the struggle was and how struggle would be long and the battle wouldn't be without sacrifice. But he persevered. He believed in an America that few could see. He believed that this place could be made better. What a lesson for all of us to believe like that. Yesterday, I had lunch with a journalist who covered Dr. King in the 1960s, and he reminded me that one of the most unacknowledged strengths of Dr. King was his courage. Yes, he had the courage to change a nation, but even more significantly, he had the courage to continue when his home was bombed. He had the courage needed to stare down a mob in Philadelphia, Mississippi. He had the courage to march through a hail of rocks and epithets in Chicago. And he had the courage to survive an attack by state troopers in Marion, Alabama. Dr. King's life reminds us that there is no change without courage and without vision for the future. So today, we mourn the loss of a leader of a movement that helped to transform a country. Sometimes I wonder, what kind of nation would we have had if Dr. King had lived that long life that he so richly deserved. But rather than mourn the loss, I choose to celebrate the life of a man whose spirit, whose sense of hope, whose vision should be with us always. After all, whenever someone values the hard-fought right to vote, Dr. King will be there. Whenever someone has the courage to right a moral wrong, Dr. King will be there. Whenever someone speaks truth to power, Dr. King is there. And whenever someone demands that America be the America of our dream, of his dream, he'll be there. How lucky we are, how blessed we are as a nation to get to celebrate this amazing life, a life well lived, a life that made us all better. And as Dr. King would say, it is up to us to continue the journey to that beloved community, to that more perfect union. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Martin Luther King III.
Let me thank God for the opportunity to be here. Speaker Ryan, Leader Pelosi, Chairman Richmond, Congressman Cleaver, Dr. Bunch, and I have to save my own congressman for last. Our great Congressman, the Honorable John Lewis. My wife and I are certainly honored to be here for this commemoration on behalf of the King family. And it is always a special honor to come to our nation's capital. But as I stand here and reflect 50 years ago on April 4th, I was watching the evening news with my siblings, and it was flashed across the screen that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has just been shot. As a 10-year-old kid, that was the most traumatic incident of my life. We ran to Mom and Dad's room to get an understanding of what was going on, and at the time, Mother was preparing to go to Memphis to be at Dad's side. Obviously, I'll never forget that day because my mother lost her husband, and my brother and sisters and I lost a father. But the nation gleamed a message and an understanding of a movement that although we still are not where we need to be, we are a much better nation because of that movement. Let me rush just to, again, thank the United States Congress for this acknowledgement, but also try to encourage us with a little bit of a challenge. Dad and Mom showed us that it only takes a few good women and men to bring about change, and they demonstrated that. And while there are many problems that exist in our nation, I want to focus briefly on the great energy that we see this year, nonviolent movements, from what Black Lives Matter have continued to do, from the Me Too movement, and most recently, a high school student-led movement in Parkland, Florida. Congressman, we haven't seen a movement like that. Congressman Lewis, of course everybody knows this, but we hadn't seen a movement like that in 55 years when students in Birmingham left their high school students, their classrooms, and were arrested, over 3,000 of them. So whether we agree with what these students are doing or disagree, We should applaud them for leading us. We had the very fortunate of our daughter having to say a few words. And of course, today, I've run into 10 people, and everyone asks, where's your daughter, and when is she going to give her next speech? And I'm like, she's in 4th grade. She's at school. But in all seriousness, Dad and others used to say that the time is always right to do that which is right. And that there's nothing more powerful than all the world than an idea whose time has come. Perhaps the idea of us truly as a nation working together is looking at us and staring us in our eyes, and somehow we're going to do it. We may not know today exactly how it's going to happen, but it's got to happen, because this is a great nation, and there are great people in this nation. And the power really is in the people. Again, that's what these young people are showing us. Dad talked about eradication of poverty, racism, militarism, and violence. We might say we hadn't made enough strides in any of those areas, for sure. We've made strides, but certainly not enough. I mean, we should be embarrassed to have poverty in this nation with a $20+ trillion economy. And I'm not saying give people money necessarily, but can't we create opportunities so that all boats can be lifted? We should be able to do that in America. We will get beyond racism. Yes, we are somewhat racially divided, but far more Americans are not racist than those who are. We may have racial attitudes and views, but those can change. And I think that the kids that we see today are working and showing us how that's going to happen. And the final thing, militarism and violence. We have to get to the day where we will study war no more, where we will put down our swords and shields. We can do that, and America has to lead. It will not happen unless America is engaged in leading. Again, a few good women and men. Dad said the ultimate measure of a human being is not where they stand in times of comfort and convenience, but where you stand in times of challenge and controversy. On some questions, cowardice asks, is a position safe? Expediency asks, is a position politic? Vanity asks, is a position popular? But that's something deep inside called conscience. Ask, is a position right? Sometimes we must stand up for positions that are neither safe nor popular nor politic, but we must stand up for those positions because our consciences tell us this, they are right. That's our challenge as a nation. It's a challenge that I know we can meet. Again, thank you. And may God bless each and every one of you always.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the benediction.
Back in the 80s, when I was in the City Council of Kansas City and preparing for running for mayor, I became a little overheated in the way things were going, so I decided to spend a weekend in Houston with my sister, and I just wanted to rest. So I'm sitting in the living room looking at the Houston Chronicle, and I turned to the section on movies, and there was a full-page ad that said Star Wars, and then it had all the characters, you know, Luke Skyjacker, H2O, you know, the whole group. and it said in bold letters, right under that, "See Star Wars. May the Force be with you." And then under that it had, "For 2 weeks only." May the force of God that worked through Martin Luther King be with this Congress and the people of this nation, not just for 2 weeks, not just for today, but forevermore. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain at your seat for the departure of the official party.